But remember, the colonists had arrived into a world where people already lived. When the British set foot on the North American continent at Jamestown, they encountered the Powhatan Indians. The Pequots and the Narragansetts lived in New England as the Pilgrims and the Puritans established their new home there. As the first group to encounter the English, the Algonquins became the first to illustrate the deep cultural misunderstandings between British settlers and Native Americans. British Americans thought Algonquin women were oppressed because of their work in the fields. Algonquin men laughed at the British men who farmed, traditionally work reserved for females in their society. Hunting was a sport in England, so British settlers thought the Algonquin hunters to be unproductive. Natives didn't build or accumulate furniture. They didn't tend to animals. They didn't have beds or linens. They displayed their bodies, favoring nudity and animal skins over proper English clothing in the Englishman's mind. They referred to bodily functions rather matter-of-factly. They didn't swaddle their babies and allowed toddlers to run around naked. They had a habit of frequent bathing, exposing their bodies directly to the air and water and to the view of others. As a healthy, attractive people, they were seen as a serious threat to the morals and piety of the Puritan community. The greatest misunderstanding, though, was that of land ownership. In the minds of Algonquins, selling land was like selling air. You couldn't. Eventually, this confusion would lead to armed conflict. The Powhatan organized a confederacy. Virginians were met with strong resistance as they plunged westward. In 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy nearly wiped out the struggling Jamestown colony in what came to be called the Anglo-Powhatan War. Frustrated at the continuing conflicts, Nathaniel Bacon and a group of vigilantes destroyed the Pamunkey Indians before leading an unsuccessful revolt against colonial authorities in 1676. Intermittent warfare also plagued early Dutch colonies in New York. In New England, Wampanoags, under the leadership of Metacomet, fought with Puritan farmers over the encroachment west onto Indian land. In 1636, a Pequot Indian was accused of murdering a colonist in Massachusetts. For revenge, the colonists set fire to a Pequot village and killed its inhabitants. The Pequots in turn fought back, and by 1638, the few surviving Pequots had signed the Treaty of Hartford, and the Pequot nation ceased to exist. This campaign of annihilation seemed to foreshadow the future. In 1674, King Philip, as the colonists called him, leader of the Wampanoags, resenting colonists' attempt to convert Native Americans to Christianity, prepared his people for war. A spy warned the colonists, but when that spy was found murdered, the colonists responded by executing 3 Wampanoags. King Philip then began to attack colonial settlements. Eventually, the colonists won, and the Native Americans in New England ceased to be a threat to them. Employing native auxiliaries and a scorched earth policy, the colonists nearly exterminated the Narragansetts, Wampanoags, and Nipmunks between 1675 and 1676. The pacifists were the notable exceptions to the destruction of native societies. Pennsylvania refused to raise a militia against native peoples for as long as Quakers dominated that government. So now we look at labor in the colonies. Now, many of the immigrants who came from England arrived as indentured servants, contracted to work for a landowner for a specified number of years, usually 7, although it depended on the age of the individual, with children being indentured longer than adults, and those with particular skills being indentured for shorter periods of time than those who were common laborers. But this began to change by the 1670s. A decrease in the English birth rate, partly due to unemployment and starvation, caused less people to seek servitude, and those that did could request more concessions from their employer, such as less time, more benefits at the end, like tools, clothing, or even land. Since employers were less inclined to do this, this scarcity of laborers was partly responsible for a shift to slavery as a primary labor force, especially in the southern colonies. Another factor influencing this shift was Bacon's Rebellion, fought largely by former indentured servants who wanted control of Indian land and were looking for a scapegoat for various problems within the colony. They also resented the wealthy Easterners dominating the fur trade with the Native Americans. Governor William Berkeley favored keeping the status quo with the natives, including negotiating various disputes, and he was seen as favoring the Eastern elites in that colony. Bacon's men attacked Indian settlements and even attacked Jamestown in what was basically a power struggle between those in the western part of the colony and those in the east. This ultimately caused the recall of the governor to England. From that point, landowners hoped to find what they labeled as less troublesome laborers and turned more and more to slaves, since slaves would never be granted freedom and therefore would never gain political rights. It is important to note that slavery was allowed and existed in all of the English colonies. It was more dominant in the southern colonies. Slaves were brought to the American colonies directly from Africa, as well as from existing Caribbean colonies, though those slaves or their ancestors had, of course, previously been brought from Africa. The voyage to the New World was harsh, and it was not uncommon for 25% or more of slaves to die on the crossing, referred to as the Middle Passage. Upon arriving in the New World and in the slave markets of North America, these people were auctioned off, much like any livestock would have been. New owners sometimes even branded their slaves to indicate ownership. Now, slaves did not accept their fate without protest. There were many instances of rebellion. These rebellions existing in colonial times and even later, and these rebellions were not confined to the southern colonies. In fact, one of the earliest examples of a slave uprising was in 1712 on the island of Manhattan, which is New York. As African Americans in the colonies grew greater and greater in number, there was a paranoia on the part of white settlers that a violent rebellion could occur near their homes. It was this fear of rebellion that led to slaves being subjected to harsh rules called slave codes. Slavery was also defined as a condition inherited through the mother. So even if children were born to a slave woman and a free man, regardless of his color, they were considered slaves. It was a crime in most locations to teach a slave how to read or write, and not even religious conversion could guarantee freedom for an enslaved individual. As time passed and the number of African Americans in the New World increased, so did the fears of their white captors. With each new rebellion, the slave codes became ever more strict, further limiting the rights and privilege that this oppressed people might hope to enjoy.